this group project, our group studied the topic of blended families, and within the subject matter, we are going to cover in this presentation a description of the problem and area of study. We're going to support with literature review, as well as covering an explanation of the relevance to counseling and also the relevance to minority populations, as well as we will be covering appraisal of how the problem and topic is addressed by mental health counselors. And finally, we're going to conclude and give thoughts on future research or treatment. So I think the first question we need to ask in this presentation is, what are blended families and how are they prevalent today? Anderson describes the demographics of families as rapidly changing, and that the philosophical underpinnings of relationships are also changing. And so what we're seeing in today is a coming away from the traditional nuclear structure of a family, more and more commonly. And what that looks like is, within the traditional aspect of a family, you have mother and father married with children within one household from that marriage. And Anderson reports that today, cohabitating is very common, and it's actually a common belief that if a relationship does not provide personal happiness, parents often feel that their children will adapt to a new family relationship. So basically, the solution is divorce or separation, as it is believed by many to have few long-term effects and adverse consequences. And that's a key to understand, because while many may believe that it's few consequences to divorce, we will find in research, and we're going to highlight that throughout this presentation, that it's not the case, that there are many consequences to divorce. And we see that it's very common today to see households with blended families, especially because cultural norms and laws are actually changing. There was something Anderson discusses as, it's called a no-fault divorce law that was passed. And this just basically makes it very easy today to get a divorce without much legal trouble or inconvenience. And so this has actually increased the levels as well and the prevalence today. As far as Weimer's research, he says that high rates of repartnering after first childbearing unions in the United States have created a high prevalence of blended families in our culture here in the United States. And he's actually found that nearly 30% of American households have step-kin tie, either in the parent or adult child generation of their family. And actually 41% of all births in 2009 were to unmarried women, nearly 1 in 5 births to women in their 30s with non-marital in 2007, compared with 1 in 7 in 2002. Anderson also says children's lives track with these statistics. In 1970, we saw 84% of children lived with their married biological parents, whereas by 2009, only 60% did so. So wow, what a change throughout about that 30 to 40 year span. And today we're in 2020 and it's only increasing. So we do see that this is a very relevant and prevalent concern in society today in our culture. So does research confirm the cultural belief that it's easy and with little consequence to start a new family with children? And we find here in our research that no, it does not. Anderson actually says that there's been nearly 3 decades of research evaluating the impact of family structure on the health and well-being of children. And it demonstrates that children living with their married biological parents consistently have better physical, emotional, and academic well-being. And we see throughout research that the consequences of divorce and blended families actually affect a lot of areas such as relationships, education, physical, emotional well-being, religious practices, and even parental and children relationships. And I'm going to highlight a few of these areas. We see, as far as relationships, that children often lose family traditions and celebrations and daily routines. Even adult children who parents divorced later in life experience loss of family traditions and disruption of connectedness and bonding within family structure. As far as education, we see that it's been reported that children with divorced parents or blended families continue to score significantly lower on measure of academic achievement and self-concept and social relations. Children also are less likely to have lower grade point average and be asked to repeat a year of school. As far as physical and emotional well-being, Anderson reports that 12% of children in nuclear family were considered in poor health versus 22% of children in single-parent homes or blended families. Children also have typically developed learning disabilities or attention deficit disorders in blended families. And also, there's been a higher rate significantly of suicide rates in young men, specifically young men in blended families. Emotional distress, severe psychiatric disorders, developed addictions, and emotional and behavioral distress are reported by Anderson as well. And it's also found that religious practice following blended families we see that children are less likely to keep their faith and are typically reported to abandon faith during situations and environments such as blended families. We also see effects on parents, and parents experience adverse effects on their physical health and financial well-being, which can also in turn trickle down to the children as well, which we see in Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems, that the health of the parents has an effect on the child. And I also want to highlight in Bronfenbrenner's ecological system that the macro system of today's culture and society really affects households as well. And I know that I can personally speak to this as I've seen this in my day. Just the commonality of divorce and blended families, and that the media and the government and the laws that are passed, but as well as just really the culture has just normalized it. And we see it all over, social platforms such as, commercials and advertisement and TV shows and movies and music. Just the normalizing of blended families. And I just think about how that really has an effect. It's the macro system on our belief systems as children and as we grow into adulthood. And so we just see that this is really becoming quite an issue for the mental health, emotional health, and just the well-being overall of humanity. Our text shows us that second marriages are more likely to fail and end in divorce, especially when children are involved. And Growing Self actually says that 66% of second marriages with children fail. And the reason is just because of how difficult it is. Unfortunately, a lot of second marriages do not seek counseling, and the majority of marriages that seek counseling are the first time newlyweds. And while that is great, and they do, of course, need counseling, it's even more imperative for second marriages, especially with children, to seek counseling, because there's more people involved than just the two getting married. There's also children involved. So there's a lot more obstacles like miscommunication that can be present in a second marriage. And some great questions to ask in counseling are, what are the expectations about the parenting roles
to each other's children. Both parents need to consider what they expect of their spouse with their own children. And also, how are the differences going to be handled with their different parenting styles? And then even more is what happens if the spouse is upset with something that that person's child does, but there doesn't seem to be an issue with the child's parents' belief. How is that going to be handled? Is that going to cause an issue? What are some ways that they can resolve that? That's something that is going to be a great tool to explore in counseling, and that's one of the benefits in counseling, is learning how to adapt both with the children and the parents, and how to approach those topics. Something else that is extremely important in blending families is creating bonds, especially if the ex-spouse is involved with custody of the stepchildren. And a great way to create a bond is when the step-parent picks up their stepchild, do something fun. Take them to get ice cream. This creates a positive environment, a positive experience between the stepchild and the step-parent, and it also signals the end of their biological parents' routine. But also, it's just fun. So creating these new traditions is extremely important to bond the family together and show them that they can have their own traditions with their biological family, but they can also have traditions with their step family. What is extremely crucial, no matter the relationship, is communication. Communication with the adults and the children is imperative. Everyone needs to be aware of what's going on, so there isn't any misunderstandings as far as like discipline, what's expected of the children, things like that. Something else that is an issue is the conflict between biological parents. When there is stress and conflict between the biological parents, that automatically produces more stress on their child. And so that's really going to create a more traumatic experience for the child, that they are going to grow up and not only experience this type of event once, but possibly twice. And the reason it's more difficult, the child can lash out in different ways, like academically, socially, behaviorally. And that is already a fragile relationship between the parents, but that makes it more so with the child. And when you're able to approach this in counseling, that's really going to help solidify the relationship between the parent and the child, that the issues behaviorally, socially, academically, and it's going to be handled correctly, not just hoping that it goes away on its own. It will be communicated, the child will be able to communicate to the parent, and so on, and a resolution will be able to be found because of the mediator that counseling provides. There is actually a large number of ethnic minority groups, and that is 1/3 of our youth being members of the ethnic minority. And the way that they go about getting their identity is in 3 different phases. There is the unimportant phase, which is really more or less the childhood phase, where they don't really care. They're just more interested on playing and having fun. And then there's phase 2, which is exploring ethnic impact. That is where they start creating interest in exploring their ethnic identity. They want to learn about who they are, where they came from. And then third is achieving distinct ethnic concept. That's where they have a firm grasp on who they are with their ethnic identity. They are secure in who they are, and they know where they come from. And interestingly enough, adolescents with a strong ethnic identity tend to be more confident, and they have a lot more satisfaction in relationships. And just as important, they are actually less bothered, for the most part, by discrimination. And the reason behind that is because they are secure, they know their worth, they know who they are, where they come from, and they're confident. And that helps to give them, by having their ethnic identity, that helps to give them a reason to overlook the discrimination. But there are those who are of mixed ethnicities that face a particular struggle, and they're a minority that even parents, their own parents, do not understand. And these are people who are in mixed marriages but have different children of different ethnicities. So that becomes a minority that parents cannot relate to because they are either Caucasian or African American. They are either Caucasian or Asian or Mexican American. The list goes on. They are one or the other, but the children are both. So that's something that makes it very difficult for the parents to understand, and they don't really truly grasp the racism that can affect a child, and lack that deeper understanding that builds a barrier between the child and the parent, in just a way that they can't understand each other, not that there is a relational issue. There is also something interesting. African Americans seem to have even more of a struggle. Their divorce rate is even higher. It's at 70%. And a large part of that is because of racism. But there's also a study done in 2019 that shows that African Americans are more likely to be part of a blended family. And what I found distressing was the lack of information for blended minority families. I found a lot of information for minorities and also for blended families, but not blended minority families. And that just tells me that there is a need for this type of information to come out. And, you know, we have the programs, the information available to the majority, but not to the minorities. And that's not okay. We have to have a way to build and help the minorities succeed so that it's not leaving a group of our population behind. It's very important to include the minority in the populations because, you know, seeing the numbers of 70% divorce rates and also being more likely to be involved in a blended family, that tells me that there's a need there for some counseling, that they would benefit from that, but often perhaps those counselors do not have the information they need. And means we need to do more studies and understand better the conflict facing minorities and blended minority families.
Appraisal of the different therapeutic interventions and counseling methods used to deal with blended families. The different interventions and methods used can on the severity of the case and the severity of the negative emotional and cognitive impact on both the parents and the child. But a lot of these interventions tend to be focused specifically on the child. For mild to moderate cases, a lot of the times individual psychotherapy might be enough just to help the child reorient to their new living situation. Most children tend to show marked improvement in functioning, either to the level of pre-divorce or in some cases slightly above within 2 to 3 years. For some children, they do not return to pre-divorce levels of functioning, and that would be something where it would be considered a little bit more moderate to severe. Another approach would be, as opposed to an individual psychotherapy, another approach would be the family systems approach, where it deals with the family unit and the individual subsystems within that unit. A lot of the times this involves the entire family in the same counseling session and analyzing the dynamics there. There's also the single versus multi-professional approach. Sometimes one therapist is enough to diffuse the situation. Other times it requires the help of, say, like one therapist as well as a psychiatrist or a social worker. So there are a lot of advocates for the multi-professional approach as well. And then, of course, psychoeducation is one of the main interventions, especially in the mild to moderate cases, to just as a form of nearly preventative treatment. The earlier you can catch the divorce and the separation of the family in process, typically the better received psychoeducation will be, and the smoother the process can turn out. A lot of that involves making sure that the parents are involving the children in age-appropriate ways, making sure that they don't put the blame of that on the children, making sure that there's not a lot of contempt, there's not a lot of manipulation in these scenarios. Just basic things like that for more mild cases. In some severe cases, psychiatrists and psychotherapists can recommend custody reversal or a change in custody, depending on the extent of the alienation of a particular child to a particular parent. Many different interventions are included. In between those levels, of course, most often the therapist will find themselves playing the role of mediator. In various family systems approaches, they'll be the one directing conflict mediation. And another main role of the therapist would be to create a therapeutic and clinical space for emotional reprocessing to occur. Depending on the severity of the cases, they can even start to treat children who've been through a really, really nasty divorce, or maybe this is like their parents' 5th divorce or something like that. They start treating them as trauma, with trauma-based interventions, because for a child, it is to a level traumatic. A lot of those interventions are whole-brained interventions. Specifically, they involve right brain interventions like art or music or bibliotherapy. All of those seem to be producing fairly good results. And the last part of counseling methods would be counselor education. Many counseling programs nowadays require a multicultural education emphasis or training, where you are trained to interact with clients who are of different backgrounds of you, different races, ethnicities, socioeconomic status, different gender, religion, family of origin. And this is touched on in that kind of education, and it's a good basis for the counselor to later build on through continuing education, continuing supervision, and most importantly, experience in these matters.
Into blended families. 65% of divorced children experience no contact with their parents in the first year after divorce. This is important because as a family arrives together in marriage, most married children experience the best secure attachment from both parents, both the mother and the father. So when that attachment is ripped away from a child due to divorce, it will have some challenges that it will provide challenges that a child will basically most likely be affected by. Divorced children are likely to receive professional help. One of every 3 clients statistically will most likely be affected by the adversity and transition of being a part of a blended family, especially from divorced children. And I think this is very important to know because there will be certain type of disorders that these children will display due to the fact that there are no longer secure in having an attachment with both parents. For example, there's 3 disruptive behavior disorders that counselors need to be aware of when it comes to counseling a divorced child. One is the mood and disturbed mood disorder that the child will display. And basically, that's a mental health problem, a person's emotional state. It is a disorder in which a person experiences long period and is excessive happiness, anxiety, and sadness that will come from a child. The next one will be anxiety disorder, and this involves repeatedly outbreak of sudden feelings of intensive anxiety and fear that reaches a peak within minutes. And an example of this would be a panic attack. A child just thinking, by joining a new family, would they experience the same love or different traditional things that the old family used to do. And the third one is separation anxiety. And this basically is when symptoms are excessively it basically develop from ages and cause considerably distress in daily functions. And these symptoms may include reoccurring and extreme distress about anticipating or being away from home or loved ones, worried about losing parents, or trying to adapt into a new blended family. Consistently, basically, this separation anxiety is consistently worrying about something bad will happen. Moral conclusion of a blended family. Our text basically tells us that 1 in 3 Americans are part of a blended family. This number will increase as nuclear family continue to become fragile over time within our society. Something to take into consideration. Overall, there is a mixture of all kinds of aspects of emotion and conditioning in which a lot of conditioning support needs to be in place for 2 families to become something of somewhat of a whole. Basically, children will have the hardest part in all of this with learning how to basically share their parents and or surroundings or their surroundings. It is up to the parents to sacrifice and do what they need to do to help the children and the family to work at becoming a cooperative system. This means at least 1 out of 3 individuals in America are affected by the changes that come with maintaining old family tradition with navigating into a new family. Oftentimes, the struggles begin with the labels that are placed on being on a blended family. Labels such as blended or reconstituted, remarried, second, reorganized. These labels places new stress on an already stressful situation, placing judgment and expectations on new families before they even begin. Morgan basically states that children in blended families are at much greater risk of being both um, scholastically and emotionally abused than they from intact families. Dropouts are twice the rate from intact families. There's are twice as likely to be expelled or suspended from school. Consistently staying in trouble. A statistic shows that there's lower test scores, lower grades, and more replacement in remedial classes for children that have been divorced into a new family. And we also have their social pressure that involved in mothers that has to take the role of being the leading statistic family. Has been emphasized as a woman's true purpose in life for over 200 years. Mothers are expected to expend tremendous amount of time and energy in raising children. So basically, being a part of a blended family, it's not always a bad thing. It can actually be a great thing. It just depends on the parents' part of dealing with the effects by the divorce, and depending on the circumstances of their parents, children may feel differently about the ideal of having step families. So, like I said, there's a social impact on children that they will experience when it comes to being a part of a blended family. However, all of this means the average above range analyze of self-esteem and self-concept data, indicating no overall difference between the two family group. In conclusion, there will be different roles within the family, social impacts, how families are changing, not widely studied yet, mainly because the changes are recent. The best studies of families are long term.
So this concludes our research about blended families, and as we can see, it is a very relevant issue today in society, and we just hope and pray that with research and the findings that are coming about, that society and healthcare systems, the counseling world, and just the culture in general will begin to partner with the well-being of the family structure and continue to make improvements. So this concludes our presentation.